From Isolation to War, Redefining Freedom. Lecture terms. The Road to World War II. Focus question. What steps led to American participation in World War II? Isolation or war? The country, facing economic crisis in the 1930s, international affairs garnered little public attention at all. But FDR innovated in foreign and domestic policy. In 1933, trying to encourage trade, he recognized the Soviet Union. Roosevelt also repudiated the right to intervene with military force in the internal affairs of Latin American nations. He called this the Good Neighbor policy. The United States withdrew troops from Haiti and Nicaragua and accepted Cuba's repeal of the Platt Amendment, which, if you recall, had authorized U.S. intervention in that nation from back when Teddy Roosevelt was president. But Roosevelt, like previous presidents, recognized undemocratic governments like that of Somoza in Nicaragua, Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, and Batista in Cuba. Events in Asia and Europe quickly took center stage as international order and the rule of law seemed to disintegrate completely. For example, in 1931, seeking to expand its power in Asia, Japan invaded Manchuria, which was a northern province in China. In 1937, it pushed further, committing a massacre of 300,000 Chinese prisoners of war and civilians at Nanjing. In Europe, Hitler, after consolidating his rule within Germany, launched a campaign to dominate the continent completely. He violated the Versailles Treaty by pursuing a massive rearmament program, and in 1936, he sent troops into the Rhineland, which was the demilitarized zone between France and Germany that had been established with the Versailles Treaty. The failure of Britain, France, and the United States to oppose Hitler's aggression convinced him that these democracies would not resist his aggressions. They were practicing what was known as the appeasement policy. Benito Mussolini, the father of fascism in Italy, invaded and conquered Ethiopia. When General Francisco Franco, in 1936, mounted a rebellion against the democratically elected government of Spain, Hitler and Mussolini sent men and arms to support him. In 1939, Franco won and established another fascist government in Europe, and the West did nothing to stop him. Hitler annexed Austria and the Sudetenland, which was a German area of Czechoslovakia, and soon thereafter he invaded and annexed all of Czechoslovakia as well. And still the West did nothing to stop him. Roosevelt became more and more alarmed by Hitler's actions in Germany and Europe. But in 1937, he called only for a quarantine of aggressors. Roosevelt had little choice but to follow the appeasement policy of France and Britain. France and Britain hoped that agreeing to Hitler's demands could ultimately prevent war. The memories of World War I and the devastation was still too fresh in the minds of most people in France and Britain. In 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned from the Munich Conference of 1938, which awarded the Sudetenland to Hitler and sold Czechoslovakia out. He came home promising, quote, peace in our time. War in Europe. The threat posed by Germany and Japan seemed distant to most Americans, and, in fact, Hitler had many admirers in America, from those who praised his anti-communism to businessmen who profited from business with the Nazis, such as Henry Ford. Trade also continued with Japan, including shipments of American trucks, American aircraft, and American oil, which amounted to 80% of Japan's oil supply. Many Americans now believe that American involvement in World War I had been a mistake and had benefited only international bankers and arms producers. Pacifism attracted supporters across America, from small towns to college campuses. Americans of German and Italian descent also sympathized with the fascist governments in their homelands. And Irish Americans maintained staunchly anti-British feelings because of what was happening between Ireland and Great Britain with the Home Rule issue. Isolationism dominated the Congress, which in 1935 started enacting a series of neutrality acts, banning travel on belligerent ships and arms shipments to warring nations. These were intended to prevent the United States from becoming embroiled in these international conflicts by demanding freedom of the seas. This is exactly what it had in World War I as well. Even though the Spanish Civil War was a conflict between a democratic republic and a fascist dictator, the United States and other governments imposed an arms embargo on both sides, effectively allowing Germany and Italy to help Franco overwhelm Spanish government forces there. At Munich in 1938, Britain and France capitulated to Hitler's aggression, as I mentioned in the previous slide. In 1939, the Soviet Union proposed an international agreement to oppose further German demands for territory, but Britain and France, distrusting Stalin and seeing Germany as a fortress that would check communist power in Europe, declined. Stalin then, the opportunist that he was, turned to Hitler and signed a non-aggression pact with him, even though Hitler was technically his enemy. Hitler immediately invaded Poland. Britain and France, allied with Poland, now determined that they had to declare war on Germany. Within a year, the Nazi Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war, overran Poland and much of Scandinavia, Belgium, and the Netherlands. By June 1940, German troops occupied Paris, France. Hitler now dominated Europe and North Africa, and in September of 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan formally created a military alliance known as the Axis Alliance. For 1 year, Britain, led by resolute Prime Minister Winston Churchill, alone resisted Germany. Britain heroically defended its skies from German planes and bombers in the Battle of Britain from the fall of 1940. The Germans' bombs devastated London and other cities, but the German air campaign was eventually repelled, and Great Britain would not be invaded. Toward intervention. Though Roosevelt considered Hitler a direct threat to the United States, most Americans simply wanted to avoid war altogether. After fierce debate, Congress in 1940 approved plans for military rearmament just in case, and agreed to sell arms to Great Britain on a, quote, cash and carry basis. Britain would pay in cash for arms and transport them in British ships. But Roosevelt, mindful of the presidential election that was coming up, went no further. Opponents of American intervention mobilized. They included such prominent individuals as Henry Ford, Father Coughlin, and Charles A. Lindbergh. In that 1940 election, Roosevelt broke precedent by running for a third presidential term. The Republican candidate was Wendell Willkie, a Wall Street businessman, lawyer, and amateur politician. Little differentiated the two, in reality, as both supported the first peacetime draft law, passed in September 1940, and both of them supported New Deal social legislation. However, FDR won the election by a decisive margin. After the election, in 1941, the United States came closer to the nations fighting Germany and Japan, and FDR declared that America would be a, quote, great arsenal of democracy. With Britain close to bankruptcy in its fight against the Nazis, Roosevelt had Congress pass the Lend-Lease Act. This allowed military aid to countries who promised to repay it after the war. On December 7, 1941, Japanese planes launched a surprise attack from aircraft carriers, bombing the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The assault killed more than 2,000 American soldiers and destroyed much of the base and the U.S. Pacific Fleet, except for crucial U.S. aircraft carriers, which helped win critical subsequent victories. Roosevelt, calling December 7th a, quote, date which will live in infamy, asked Congress to declare war on Japan, which it did nearly unanimously. The next day, Germany in turn declared war on America, and the United States had finally entered the largest war in history. Fighting World War II. Although in retrospect, it seems that America's robust industrial capacity assured its victory over the Axis powers. Success, however, was not sudden. The United States initially experienced a series of military disasters and watched Japan take more territory in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, including Guam and the Philippines. When they captured the Philippines, they captured tens of thousands of U.S. troops, thousands of whom died on the way to and within prisoner camps. Japan also captured other Pacific islands. But the tide of the war would eventually change in favor of the United States. This happened in late spring 1942, with the American naval victories at Midway Island and in the Coral Sea. These successes allowed the United States to begin a step-by-step, quote, island-hopping campaign to reclaim vital and strategic territories in the Pacific. From 1942 on, Japan would be on the defensive and would not be able to claim any more territory. And one by one, they would lose control of those islands that they had taken, and the United States would liberate them. In November of 1942, British and American forces invaded North Africa, and by May of 1943, they forced the surrender of German forces in that region. By this time, the Allies had also gained an advantage in the fight in the Atlantic Ocean against German submarines. While FDR wanted to liberate Europe, most American troops stayed in the Pacific at this time. In July of 1943, American and British forces will invade Sicily, and they began the liberation of Italy, whose government, led by Mussolini, was overthrown by a popular revolt of the Italians. Fighting continued against German forces there throughout 1944. America's fight in Europe actually began on June 6, 1944, a day known as D-Day, or the invasion of Normandy. On this date, nearly 200,000 American, British, and Canadian soldiers, led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, invaded Normandy in northern France. More than 1 million troops soon followed them, in the largest sea-land operation in history. The Germans resisted, but retreated, and by August, Paris had been liberated. The most significant clashes, however, took place on the Eastern Front, where millions of Germans would fight against Soviet troops. The Germans had violated the non-aggression pact that had been made prior to the war's start, and now they were embroiled in conflict in the Soviet Union. Millions of German and Soviet troops faced each other in very costly battles, particularly at Stalingrad, where a German siege ended in a German surrender to the Soviets. This was a decisive defeat for Hitler. Other Russian victories marked an end of Hitler's advance and began the beginning of the end of the Nazi Empire in Eastern Europe. A full 10 million of Germany's nearly 14 million casualties were inflicted solely on the Eastern Front, and millions of Poles and Russians, many of them civilians, perished as a result of the fighting in that region. The home front. Focus question. How did the United States mobilize economic resources and promote popular support for the war effort? The impact of mobilizing for war. Within the United States, the war transformed the role of the federal government once again. Roosevelt established several new wartime agencies, such as the War Production Board, the War Manpower Commission, and the Office of Price Administration. These agencies were designed to control labor distribution and shipping, manufacturing quotas, fixing of wages, prices, and rents as well. The number of federal workers, as a result, rose from 1 million to 4 million, and unemployment, which had been at a rate of 14% in 1940, virtually disappeared by 1943. The war was pulling the United States out of the Great Depression once and for all. The government built housing for war workers and forced civilian companies to produce material for the war effort. Auto plants now made trucks, tanks, and jeeps for the Army. The gross national product more than doubled to $214 billion during the war. And the federal wartime spending equaled twice the amount spent in all of the previous 150 years. The government sold millions of dollars in war bonds. The government would hike taxes and start taking income tax from Americans' paychecks as well. Business and the war. Ties between corporations and the federal government grew much closer during World War II. With business executives taking key positions in federal agencies supervising war industries, Roosevelt gave incentives to them to increase production. Most federal spending went to the largest companies, which sped up a long-term trend towards economic concentration, and by the war's end, the 200 biggest industrial firms represented nearly half of all corporate assets in the nation. It's a trend that we see has continued to this day. Wartime production was gargantuan in scale and shocking in its intensity, not only making military equipment by the millions, but leading to inventions such as radar, jet engines, and early computers. The war helped restore the reputation of big business that the Depression had tarnished. Federal funds restored old manufacturing areas and fostered new ones. On the West Coast, in places like Southern California, home to steel and aircraft production, and in the South, where out-migration and military-related factories and shipyards shifted employment from agriculture to industry. This in itself raised the South's income, but did not end its deep poverty. Sparse urbanization or underdeveloped economy. All of these still depended on agriculture and extractive industries like mining, lumber, and oil. Most of the manufacturing in that region was linked to agriculture, such as cotton textiles. Organized labor saw the war as a struggle for freedom that would expand economic and political democracy at home and secure its influence in politics and industry. During the war, unions were part of a three-sided arrangement with government and business that allowed union membership to rise to unprecedented numbers. To win industrial peace and stabilize war production, the federal government forced resistant employers to recognize the unions. In turn, union leaders promised not to strike and recognize employers' right to, quote, managerial prerogatives and, quote, fair profits. By the war's end, unions were entrenched in many economic sectors, and nearly 15 million workers, a third of them in the non-farm labor workforce, were now union members. This was the highest proportion in U.S. history. But labor was a less powerful partner in the war than business or government. The New Deal's decline continued during the war because there wasn't as much of a need for it. And Congress became thoroughly dominated by a conservative alliance between Republicans and Southern Democrats who retained Social Security but ended programs allegedly controlled by, quote, leftists, such as the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, and the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. Many workers protested the demanding wartime conditions and the freeze on wages imposed by the government, even while corporate profits soared. Selling the war at home. World War II came to be remembered as, quote, the Good War, in which the nation united behind noble aims. But all wars need the mobilization of public opinion. And freedom was a prominent theme in efforts to, quote, sell the war. Roosevelt believed the four freedoms represented essential American values that could be universalized across the globe. Freedom from fear meant a desire not only for peace, but for long-term security in a chaotic world. The importance of freedom of speech and freedom of religion seemed self-evident, but their prominence emphasized the new significance of the First Amendment protections of free expression. During the war, the Supreme Court's judges, contrasting American constitutional liberty with Nazi tyranny, upheld the rights of religious minorities to refuse to salute the American flag in public schools. This was done as opposed to the coercive patriotism that was around during World War I under Woodrow Wilson. The last of the four freedoms was freedom from want. Freedom from want seemed the most ambiguous of the four freedoms. Though FDR first used it to refer to eliminating barriers to trade, he soon linked this freedom to guaranteeing a standard of living for American workers and farmers by preventing a return of the Depression. FDR argued that this would bring, quote, real freedom for the common man. But many argued that there should be a fifth freedom, the freedom of free enterprise. Women and the home front. War mobilization sparked an unprecedented growth in women's employment to fill industrial jobs that were left by men who went off to fight in the war. Government and private ads celebrated the independent woman worker with images like Rosie the Riveter, the female industrial laborer, painted by Norman Rockwell as a muscle-bound and self-reliant woman, you see here in the picture. With 15 million men in the military, women in 1944 made up 1/3 of the civilian workforce, and 350,000 women served in auxiliary military units as well. Women filled industrial, professional, and government jobs previously barred to them, such as aircraft manufacturing and shipbuilding. They also forced some unions, like the United Auto Workers, to confront issues like equal pay for equal work. Other issues like maternity leave and child care were also addressed. Many women who had a, quote, taste of freedom, working men's jobs for male wages, hoped to remain in the workforce after the war was over. Yet, government, employers, and unions saw women's work as only a, quote, temporary wartime necessity. Though ads told women working in factories that they were, quote, fighting for freedom, their language promoted victory, not women's rights or independence. After the war, most women war workers, especially those in high-paying industrial positions, lost their jobs to men. Indeed, war ads informed Americans that their work would help secure, quote, the American way of life after the war. The American way of life was presented as traditional families with the women at home and the men at work, enjoying household appliances and consumer goods. Visions of post-war freedom. Focus question. What visions of America's post-war role began to emerge during the war? An American century. Dreams of post-war prosperity united New Dealers and conservatives alike. It also united business and labor. And they were promoted by two of the most famous roadmaps for the post-war world. The book, The American Century, published by the magazine magnate Henry Luce in 1941 to mobilize Americans for an imminent war, had asked Americans to prepare, quote, to become the dominant power in the world, and to distribute to, quote, all peoples American magnificent industrial products and great American ideals, particularly the love of freedom. Henry Luce believed that American power and values would secure unprecedented prosperity and abundance, all of which was created by, quote, free economic enterprise, that fifth freedom that some were pushing for. The idea that America had a mission to spread democracy and freedom had its origins in the American Revolution. But this idea traditionally saw America as an example to be emulated, not an active agent imposing an American system on others. To some left critics, Luce's appeal seemed a call for an American empire. To counter that, Henry Wallace, a liberal New Dealer, who was the former Secretary of Agriculture for FDR, and FDR's vice president beginning in 1940, responded with his own writing called The Price of Free World Victory. This was an address that he had made in May of 1942. Wallace anticipated that an Allied victory would establish, quote, a century of the common man, and that the, quote, March of Freedom would continue after the conflict. Wallace argued the globe would be governed by international cooperation, not any single power. And governments would, quote, humanize capitalism and redistribute economic resources to end hunger, end illiteracy, and end poverty. Luce and Wallace defined freedom very differently. Luce envisioned a world of free enterprise, while Wallace sought a kind of global New Deal. But they also both believed America should intervene in the world by spreading abundance and posing as a model to other nations. And they both ignored other nations' visions of the post-war world. While Congress dismantled parts of the New Deal, liberal Democrats and their left-wing allies planned for a post-war economy that would enable all Americans to enjoy freedom from want. In 1942 and 1943, the National Resources Planning Board, the NRPB, outlined a peacetime economy based on full employment, a larger welfare state, and an American standard of living. Emphasizing economic security and full employment, the NRPB called for a, quote, new Bill of Rights that would include all Americans in Social Security and guarantee education, health care, adequate housing, and employment. Liberal New Dealers, labor, farmer and civil rights groups, and churches all welcomed the NRPB's plan, whose promise of full employment and fair income distribution seemed to one liberal magazine to represent, quote, the way of life of free men. The reports showed that liberals were moving away from trying to reform capitalism to attaining full employment, social welfare, and mass consumption without much direct government intervention in the economy. They were influenced by John Maynard Keynes, who argued that government spending best fostered economic growth. Although war production had ended the Depression in a kind of military Keynesianism, the NPRB proposed a continuation of Keynesian economics in the post-war period. An increasingly conservative Congress, however, opposed the NRPB plan and cut the agency's funding. The Economic Bill of Rights. In 1944, FDR, who knew that most Americans wanted a guarantee of employment after the war, called for an Economic Bill of Rights. While the original Bill of Rights limited government power to secure liberty, this one expanded government power to secure full employment, a minimum income, medical care, education, and decent housing for all Americans. FDR declared that, quote, true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence from want. But his replacement of Vice President Henry Wallace with Harry Truman of Missouri suggested that he did not want to confront Congress over social policy, and Congress never enacted the Economic Bill of Rights as a result. In 1944, Congress did enact the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or the GI Bill, which extended to millions of returning veterans benefits such as unemployment, educational scholarships, low-cost mortgages, pensions, and job training. The GI Bill greatly shaped post-war America. It prevented post-war economic disruptions and sparked a boom in education and housing, which led to massive suburbanization as we move into the 50s. But Congress went no further. A proposed full employment bill that would have been a, quote, GI Bill for non-veterans, guaranteeing employment and requiring the federal government to increase spending if the economy itself did not produce full employment, was watered down before it passed in 1946 and did not require full employment at all. The bill's failure confirmed the political stalemate initiated in the 1938 elections, and it marked the return of respectability for the idea that economic planning ultimately endangered freedom. In 1944, Friedrich A. Hayek, an Austrian-born economist, published the book The Road to Serfdom. In this book, he argued that government planning threatened individual liberty and leads to dictatorship. When war production seemed to have restored capitalism, and fascism showed the dangers of combining economic and political power, Hayek's book gave a new justification to opponents of the activist welfare state. Hayek claimed that no person or set of experts could ever know enough to intelligently direct a complex modern economy, and that the free market's scattered and partial knowledge more effectively ran economic life. While Hayek accepted some social policies, such as minimum wage and maximum hour laws, and social safety nets that guaranteed minimal citizen welfare, and opposed traditional conservatism's love of authority, he did help establish modern conservatism by equating fascism, socialism, and the New Deal, and associating economic planning with a loss of freedom.